Thank you for your patience as we've worked through a few technical difficulties on our end, but appreciate everybody's time and patience this evening. My name's Kent Fricky. I'm the Wildlife Research Supervisor for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, based here out of headquarters in Lincoln. And tonight we're going to be requesting your input on our draft chronic wasting disease management plan for the Game and Parks Commission. Tonight, also online, we have Director Tim McCoy, Director of Game and Parks, Alicia Harden, Wildlife Division Director, Pat Mullaney, who supervises our management section, which oversees the public lands and wildlife management areas in the state, as well as Commissioner Scott Castles, who's on the Game and Parks Commission. So appreciate everybody's attendance at this important event this evening. With that, I'll turn it over to the primary speaker tonight. Todd Nordine is out of our Alliance office and is our big game research and disease program manager for Game and Parks in our research analysis and inventory section. And Todd's been in his position for quite a while out in Alliance and certainly has a lot of experience when it comes to big game and disease issues in the state. And we're looking forward to hearing the updates that Todd and the rest of our team have been working on regarding our CWD management plan that, again, we've updated and want to get this draft plan in front of folks and seek as much input as possible. So Todd, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kent, for the introduction there. Well, welcome everybody to tonight's meeting on Chronic Wasting Disease Management Plan 2024. I'll just give you a quick outline of what to expect. First of all, we're going to start off talking about some of the background information and then some of the CWD history itself, and followed by the draft plan highlights. And then towards the end, we'll talk about the time frame for this plan. And at the very end, we'll follow up with a question and answer session. What is chronic wasting disease? CWD is a fatally transmissible prion disease or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or better known as a TSE, that attacks the brain of an infected deer, elk, or moose. It was first discovered in Colorado in 1967. And this picture at the bottom of your screen illustrates exactly what one really looks like. You know, it's different from a cell or a virus, and it's also very microscopic. So something difficult to see without some pretty high-tech equipment. As mentioned, it's not a virus or a bacteria. It's actually a prion, which essentially is a malformed or deformed protein. And really what happens is this prion, once it becomes deformed, attacks other prions in the body as well, and then they become deformed. And then it essentially accumulates in the brain and ultimately causes the animal to deteriorate in health. And finally, it will cause its death. This prion can persist in the environment for decades. It's difficult to destroy, and currently there is no cure for this disease. It's believed transferred by shared bodily fluids from deer to deer, and there's no evidence to suggest it's transmissible to humans. One thing I did want to kind of clarify tonight too, in this presentation too, one of the biggest questions or confusions we get is how it relates to other diseases, and it's often confused with some of those diseases that we see in other wildlife too. And one in particular is epizootic hemorrhagic disease, or better known as EHD, or the blue tongue virus. More about comparing those different diseases. EHD commonly occurs in the late summer and early fall, whereas CWD, we can find that any time of year. EHD is transmitted to deer by a biting midge or gnat from the genus Colcoides, whereas mentioned previously, CWD, is transferred by bodily fluids from deer to deer. EHD usually ends after the first frost or after a hard freeze, killing that biting gnat or midge that's existing in the environment at that time. There's no cure for this disease either, and actually EHD has been around for decades and will continue to be around probably for many, many more. We see it every year, throughout Nebraska typically too. Many deer live through it, but some years have observed significant losses. And if you go back to the 2012 timeframe when we had our most significant losses to EHD, we probably lost 30 to 50% of deer population in some parts of the state. So it was pretty significant back at that time. Mortalities are often near water with this disease and can be observed within days, whereas with CWD, it may take a year and a half or more before symptoms become observed. EHD is not always fatal either too, whereas CWD is always fatal. And if you want to know more about EHD, you can certainly get on our website at outnorthnebraska.gov/EHD, and there's a lot more you can read about within that site. As far as CWD in Nebraska, in 1998, CWD was first detected in Nebraska in a captive elk herd. In 1999, Nebraska started its first hunter-harvested CWD surveillance program. And in the year 2000, just a year later, we confirmed CWD in a free-ranging 2-year-old mule deer in Kimball County. So since 1999, Game and Parks has tested over 57,000 deer and over 400 elk. And to date, we have 1,269 deer and 19 elk that have tested positive for the disease. And overall, we've detected the CWD in 58 counties thus far. If you take a look at this map, going back to that 1999 timeframe through 2023, this is what it looks like as far as detections within the counties of the state of Nebraska. So 58 out of 93 is where we're at so far with the detections. On a national scale, this is what it looks like across the state or across the country and up into Canada. The gray actually represents, wild deer populations that have had CWD. And the yellow dots indicate CWD in captive facilities that have since been depopulated, while the red represents current captive facilities that have been found with the disease. Here's just another look at Nebraska in terms of all of our surveillance over the last 20 plus years. Yeah, you can see the heavier concentrations or the detections out in the Nebraska Panhandle and how it has pretty much slowly progressed eastward across the state. As far as elk goes in CWD within the elk population, we implemented our first voluntary hunter-harvested CWD surveillance program in 2018. And thankfully, the positive detections have remained low in our elk herd. And this map illustrates some of those that we have found, where we have found it in the Nebraska Panhandle and a little bit in the north central part of the state. But as mentioned, thankfully, it's stayed lower in detection there with that population. I probably don't have the answer as to exactly why that is, other than one consideration is the fact that we got a much smaller population of elk than we do deer. Part of our surveillance in 2023 was focused on the north central part of the state. If you look at the Sandhills unit, Calamus East, Calamus West, Loop West, Kepaha deer management units, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen that previous surveillance was 4 to 5 years ago, and you can see some jumps to 2023, especially in the Sandhills, where we probably saw it about double. And then we've seen an increase, I guess, across the board in those units, some more significant than others. But overall, within those units, we tested 605 deer and found 31 that tested positive. For the CWD Management Plan itself, the plan serves to guide the Commission in addressing risk, developing management strategies, and protecting big game resources. The plan is not all-inclusive and is meant to be adaptive and updated as new information is discovered. A number of objectives within the plan, the first of which is to provide Commission staff, hunters, agency partners, conservation organizations, and the public with updated information and best management practices regarding CWD. Another objective is to continue and modify monitoring efforts associated with captive and free-ranging cervid herds in Nebraska as needed. Another is to monitor disease prevalence and develop strategies to adapt management as new information becomes available. And the fourth here is to routinely, about every 5 years, assess stakeholder interest and concerns about CWD by conducting stakeholder surveys, public meetings, and provide updated information through media outlets. Other objectives within the plan are as follows here: engaging in CWD related research and information sharing with other agencies and associated working groups. Create an informed stakeholder base through commission communication and other platforms, providing transparency and education information about CWD. And lastly, provide statewide, regional, and unit-specific recommendations as more becomes known about CWD. Mentioned in the first objective, the best management practices, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in 2018 developed a list of management practices for hunters and agencies alike to consider. These practices are not mandated or required by the Game and Parks Commission, but some examples of those are as follows here. Carcass movement or disposal restriction, reduce whole carcass transport distances. For instance, you could try to keep carcasses within inside a county, within inside a unit, or even from crossing state lines, and try to dispose of those in a proper manner, preferably in a licensed landfill or a dumpster. Another practice would be live animal movements, which involves the captive facility industry and possible new restrictions there. Those facilities are administered by the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, so any change there would have to be in coordination and with their partnership in doing so. Urine-based attractants, restrict or limit use of related products, could actually emphasize more use of synthetic related attractants. And unnatural concentrations of deer and elk, reduce or remove related practices. Anything that artificially concentrates deer, especially in large numbers, could be something to consider for a reduction or elimination of. There are more of these practices identified within the plan as well, and also they're listed on our website too. Another category within the CWD plan is CWD deer surveillance. Our first plan that we developed actually goes back to 2002. And so this is the first major revision of that since that time. We have had a number of surveillance strategy changes over the years, and in 2015, the Commission implemented a unit detection rate approach where the sampling effort rotates between the 4 regions in the state: the Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, and Southeast. Although some years there is some overlap or merging of those regions, as you can see illustrated on the map below. The goal for each management unit is a 90% probability of detecting CWD at a prevalence of 1% or greater. And as mentioned earlier, last year we focused on the north central part of the state, and in the Sandhills, Calumet East, Calumet West, Loop West, and Kepahaw deer management units. So, and you can see where the detections of CWD were as shown on the map. This project was initiated in 2023, and we actually just conducted our first capture in February of 2024, and we caught and radio collared 59 mule deer in the Upper Platte Deer Management Unit in the southern Nebraska Panhandle. So that one's just getting underway, so there's going to be a lot of data to come from that throughout the next couple of years. Another project we got going on is with Creighton University and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, investigating the fate and transport of CWD prions after landfill or burial. That was initiated in 2021, and we probably have about 1 year left on that project, and then we'll have some results available for that. 2021, we conducted a CWD hunter survey. We distributed over 68,000 email surveys, and we saw a return of about 6,987 for approximately a 10% rate of return. Respondents had minimal concerns about CWD. Most trusted the information shared by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Most respondents underestimated the prevalence of CWD, especially in their respective hunting units. Most respondents were receptive to some best management practices. 78% of the respondents said they would keep hunting if CWD was detected in their area, and 26% indicated that they would quit hunting altogether if there was evidence of human health risk related to CWD. Respondents, approximately 29% that had a deer test positive for CWD still ate the meat as well. Another survey is scheduled for 2026, but more information can be found within the plan itself and also on our website at outdoornebraska.gov. As far as our CWD and public outreach, we have a website full of information for folks to look at. It's easy to access, and actually most states that are dealing with CWD do have website information on their respective sites. We continue to host public big game meetings each year. We usually have 2 virtual meetings, just like what we're having tonight, followed by 2 to 4 district or regional in-person meetings as well. Our check station interactions have been invaluable. It's a great opportunity for us to visit with hunters and landowners alike and see what their feelings are about the deer populations or any disease issues and other things that may be going on in their respective areas. Stakeholder surveys, just like the one I just mentioned, and social media platforms. We're engaged with just about every major social media platform out there. As mentioned, there's a lot of information regarding CWD on the website. You can probably Google it and get all kinds of it, but a couple that might be of interest to you are the CWD Alliance and the U.S. Geological Survey. And these sites are shown here, and they're also linked to our website as well. Activities, the Commission is developing a big game disease database to better track all disease events for big game species. Our database so far is actually pretty good too, but we're trying to utilize some newer technology and able to better input and export some of that data. And we continue with collaborative efforts and working group involvement to seek new techniques and responses in combating this disease. In conclusion, our CWD plan is on our Game and Parks website at outdoornebraska.gov. We are taking public comments through August 2nd, but we prefer to have them by July 24th, if at all possible. This meeting has been recorded and will be available on our website. The final draft will be presented at the Commission meeting in August, on August 16th, in fact, at Fort Robinson State Park. And as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of information on our website, including other lab testing facilities and many of the questions that have been asked over the years too. That's all posted on our site and easily accessible for anybody to look at. We'll conclude with questions, and we'll now move into the question and answer session. Again, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Todd. And again, appreciate your work on this and everybody's patience as we've moved through things this evening. So we've got several questions in the chat, and so I'll start with those. And if folks can go ahead and keep entering their questions in there. Basically, the format from here on is I'll read those questions out, and Todd or any of our other needed experts can respond to that. So the first, Todd, should hunters and landowners avoid salt and mineral blocks to minimize transmission?
Well, that's something to consider, but there hasn't really been, I guess, evidence to suggest there's been a lot of transmission related directly to mineral blocks or salt blocks. And a lot of them are out there. Obviously, livestock producers use them. So there's going to be some use by deer and other wildlife as well. So, but yeah, I mean, that can probably avoid some artificial concentrations too, if you do want to consider that. But like I said, I don't think there's been it's not a heavy use attractant probably for most species of big game anyway, compared to other things.
All right, thank you. Another one, what do the tests cost?
Seth Lewin, I think, is on the call here yet. Seth works at the Nebraska Veterinary Diagnostic Center there in Lincoln, and a big part of doing a lot of our testing too. But if it's done, privately, I think, Seth, do you have any estimates, I guess, on that particular question? It generally is run around $50, I think, at most places, but do you have any different answer to that, Seth? Are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still on here. Thanks. I believe I don't have the catalog in front of me, but I believe it's $75. But if I'm wrong, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, it may have gone up a little bit, from what it's been in the past or over the years too. Certainly understand that. So, okay, thanks, Seth.
Next, we have for the meeting in August with the commissioners, are there any recommendations that will be made relative to testing or managing spread across the state?
It would be made relative to testing or managing the spread across the state. At this point, I think we're, continuing our current surveillance efforts too. We worked extensively with the University of Nebraska Lincoln to develop this survey methodology, and we think we're able to get a, good sample size, which represents what's going on in each deer management unit. And it certainly gives us the information we're looking for to see that spread and that increase of detections across the state too. So, we're continuing that surveillance around the state and rotating around too. So, and this year it'll actually be in the eastern periphery of our border too, and we'll be looking to test and sample in the Wahoo, Elkhorn, Loop East, Wahoo, Elkhorn, Loop East, Missouri, and Blue Northwest and Blue Southeast. So those areas where we'll be focusing most of our attention right now. But if you are interested in getting your deer tested outside of that surveillance zone, we certainly have options on our website to do that, in different labs that you can consider, as well as our own at the in Lincoln there.
All right, thanks, Todd. Another person asked, they've submitted to the university before and mentions that other states also have testing facilities. Is dropping a sample off at the UNL lab or mailing it to another lab the only options?
At this point, essentially, that's what we are doing. Yeah, with our surveillance focused, rotating around the state, we do provide those other testing facilities if anybody's interested in doing that. Some also do go to their local veterinarian and can submit a sample through them as well.
And just checking too, Todd, can you see the testing locations that I put on the screen?
Oh, sorry. No, let me minimize here. I'm trying to. Okay. Yep. All right.
Okay. Yep. Just want to make sure I was getting those up there. So thank you for the
Yeah.
question.
So Todd, this is Commissioner Castles.
Hey, Scott.
Hi, Todd. How you doing?
Not too bad.
Hey, thank you for filling us all in on what we've all been tracking, and many of the hunters have been tracking. But as you showed with your picture, we're not the only state and agency that's dealing with this, and I might have missed it because I had to step away for a little bit of an emergency. But are we sharing information between the states, and is there any kind of task forces developed that can get us ahead of this thing? Because I mean, to think that we all have a 15% of our population or 5%, whatever the number is, with a deadly disease, and other states having the same problem. I want to make sure nobody's not sharing information. This is a national problem, not just Nebraska.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Yeah, a good
Learning
question.
from others.
Yeah, good question, Scott. And absolutely. But yes, we are a big part of that overall picture nationally. We're involved with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, plus all the other state agencies in general. And we sit on various working groups, and we've collaborated on a number of research efforts too in trying to combat this disease. But as far as answering your question and getting ahead of it, it's tough. Most states that are now getting it are just kind of following the same routine that the rest of us did that got it, and then trying to develop strategies to at least reduce the spread. And so, but yes, we are actively engaged all across the nation and into Canada as well.
Well, what I also find interesting is I know the commission will be reviewing this at our next meeting, but for the people that are hunted on the West Coast with blacktails, I don't see any signs there. And the other thing I kind of maybe just hasn't got down that far yet is in the warm Southeast where, whitetails are like rabbits. And so I don't know if there's anything to be learned there.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's certainly, things that are on our radar, and it's a good question as to why it hasn't actually developed or shown up in some of those western areas or in the southeast too. Texas, to be honest with you too, is one that actually took a while, for it to show up there, but they, as you know, have a lot of movement of wildlife within their state and so forth. And so it was kind of surprising that it didn't show up there until a little bit later on. Whereas a lot of the rest of the central part of the state, we've seen it for many, many years.
Sure. Well, something we need to make sure the states are looking at, because
Yeah,
there might be some
absolutely. And
signs there.
everybody is. And actually, we have monthly conference calls about CWD now with most of the states across the nation. So,
All right. Thanks for your report today.
yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Another question, are there field tests that a hunter could use when field dressing a deer to detect CWD?
No, there's been a number of them that have been tried, but we have not been able to verify any of those as consistent with any of the standard tests that Seth was talking about there and that they do at the Nebraska Diagnostic Center or any other lab for that matter. The typical method is using what we call an ELISA or IHC immunohistochemistry test. And, Seth could maybe elaborate more on that if he wants to, but that's the gold standard. And none of these field tests have lived up to that. And have been able to be verified with the confidence or efficiency that those standards have set. And so, yeah, there's people still looking, but unfortunately, there is no field test at this point in time that would live up to those standards anyway.
Yeah, those
Seth?
are usually, I was gonna say, those are the gold standards, the ELISA and IHC. It's usually goes through the process of ELISA first, and if something's suspect, then we do IHC to confirm it. But that being said, there's a new technology kind of coming around. VMRD is coming out with it, not validated by anybody just yet, but they're hoping for it, and it's a rapid test, and that I could see that if it does happen to be successful, I could see that getting developed into a field test at some point down the road. So it's not out of the woods yet,
Yeah, it's one of those things that continues to be researched, and hopefully, yeah, it will develop into something that's can be quickly determined, perhaps on site. So, but yeah, that's just one of those continuing efforts that folks across the country are looking at.
Another question, Todd. Are you considering implementing any restrictions with regard to mineral supplements or attractants or importing carcasses from other CWD affected states into Nebraska?
Not at this time. Those things are stuff that we will consider as we move along too. But so far, most of our emphasis on CWD has been on the surveillance and the detection and the spread and so forth. So we haven't, I guess, felt the strong need or sought the approval, I guess, of our commission at this point to implement anything stronger. A lot of states do it differently. Just you go across the board and different things have been tried all over the nation. And I guess it's probably difficult to say that any have been 100% effective, so there's probably differing degrees of opinions on that too. But, states like Wyoming, I will say too, have implemented those kind of restrictions.
Board is exciting.
Pardon? I missed that if somebody said something too, but other states have, implemented more restrictions too, but it seems that there's still other means of transmission of this disease and been unable to really stop it in any great efficiency along the way. So we have not gone that route just yet too, but it's stuff that we're always considering and evaluating. But so far, we think our surveillance methodology is at least keeping us in tune with what's going on across our deer management units in the state. And if we see newer technology or newer information develops that, might be more effective, yeah, we're certainly going to entertain, those kind of things as well.
Thanks, Todd. As you know, many or several states to the south of Nebraska have exotics, both in captivity and not in captivity. One question that we had, has CWD shown up in any of the exotics in Texas in particular, but any other state in addition?
Not that I'm aware of or can recall right here. I don't know if Seth or I don't know, Bill Meyer with the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, if you're on here, Bill, too, if you're aware of any in captive facilities, those are administered through another agency or department. So there may be of some that they're aware of, but none that I'm aware of. Certainly not aware of any in Nebraska in terms of exotics that exist in some of those captive facilities. Don't believe there's been any that have been confirmed with CWD.
Thanks, Todd. Is there anything that can be done to restrict captive deer or elk farms and facilities?
Well, as I mentioned, those are administered, or jurisdictional authority is done through the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. And so I know they consider different things or different restrictions or have specific protocols and guidelines right now to deal with CWD in captive facilities. And sometimes that actually involves depopulating an area or reducing the numbers within that facility. But all that has to be followed in collaboration with their protocols and their guidelines too. So that would be another question probably for them, but we do work with them extensively when it comes to various CWD positives, whether it's in captive facilities or in the wild too. But that part is actually under their jurisdiction, and so we'd be working with them to address any additional restrictions as well.
Thanks, Todd. We had another question asking, and if I'm correct in this or not correct in this, let me know, Todd. But we had a question about when we detect a positive, we detect where, as closely as we can tell, we put that location in at least the county of where it was harvested, not the county of, for example, where the deer was processed or where the hunter lives, correct?
Correct. During our check station process, we ask that information. We of course ask a lot about the deer itself, the age and the sex and all the different things. We try to get as much detailed information at deer check stations as we can. But part of that too, when somebody's interested in testing for chronic wasting disease, and us collecting that sample, we gather additional information in that regard. And right now we're collecting information based on the location of kill from the nearest town. And so if they give us a direction like 4 miles north of Alliance and 3 miles east, we punch that into the computer and it generates a GPS point for us. And so, yes, the accuracy is not 100%, but it does give us a fairly close proximity to where that animal was harvested and where that CWD detection was.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So when hunters harvest a deer, bring it home, either process it themselves or I guess specifically for this question, process it themselves. Oftentimes, a local garbage service will not take it. Are there recommendations for how to for a hunter who butchers their own deer to deal with that carcass then?
As far as the carcass after it's been the meat has been removed, is that what?
Yes.
Yeah, the recommendations are to take that carcass and double bag it, preferably if you can, or the carcass parts, and then put that in a dumpster or take it to a licensed landfill. That's the safest place to take it, and hopefully reduce any spread of that prion from any contamination in the soil nearby.
All right. Thanks, Todd. Does the virus reproduce in the soil? Does it travel through soil movements? For example, mud on the vehicle or mud on boots?
Well, it's not a virus or a bacteria. You know, it is that prion that we discussed early in the presentation, and it's very, very difficult to kill, and it does persist in the soil and can persist in the soil for decades. And so, yes, there is that possibility that it could be picked up off the soil, on your boots, on the tires. You know, those are the kind of things that we're trying to learn more about actually with that. And part of our study that I talked about with the Creighton University and University of Nebraska Lincoln is just, you know, what happens to that prion after burial or after it's entered the soil? You know, does it move laterally, and how is it distributed too? But so yeah, that's still a good question we're trying to understand more about. But yes, the potential is there.
Okay. Another question, kind of concerning the plan in general and thresholds. Is there a rate of positive testing results by the statewide surveillance that may require the Game and Parks Commission to consider alternative measures? For example, the reference here Wisconsin, but several other states have CWD positive deer drop locations in order for the carcasses to be disposed without further spread. So I guess the primary piece of the question is there a rate of positive testing results that would require Game and Parks to consider alternative measures?
We don't have that in our plan at this point too. Yes, recognizing that other states and most states do it differently. And some are more regimented and look to those specific detection rates as kind of a response at a certain point. We have not implemented anything like that at this point. But we do go with a lot of those recommendations that are out there, you know, in terms of disposal and to try to reduce the spread. So we try to follow some of those recommendations, you know, like the carcass movement stuff that I mentioned earlier too. You know, it is absolutely best. One of the best practices is to take that carcass and take it to a licensed landfill or double bag it, put it in a dumpster, that type of thing. So trying to reduce the distance of travel with those carcasses is just one of the things we can do on our own or as an agency too. But those things, we haven't got into the specific details of trying to require that. You know, we're still making those recommendations without necessarily mandating any of those things too. Like I said earlier, you know, there's still a lot unknown about this disease, and the states that have done a lot of those, implementing a lot of those restrictions too, are still seeing just as high a frequency or detection rates, even as we are in Nebraska or South Dakota and other states that aren't as regimented in terms of a response to increased rates.
Thanks, Todd. And while we're still on kind of the surveillance side of things here, we had a question come in. Are any roadkill deer tested?
We have done that on occasion, but we don't have a specified program, I guess, set up to actually do that. But it isn't to say that we haven't or won't in the future too. If there's some indication that particular animal was sick, or that was maybe the reason that it got hit because it was standing out there on the highway, you know, sick or delirious, incoherent, yes, we would consider testing animals of that nature too.
And maybe along those same lines, Todd, could you briefly describe the protocol of if our staff or someone reports a sick deer or sick looking deer?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, our protocol or our response, I guess, as soon as we receive those calls, we try to get more detailed information about them, and we try to respond to it as quickly as possible. If it's something we can get to within preferably 24 to 48 hours, depending on the time of year. Summertime, it's a lot more difficult to get to them in a timely manner, where a sample collection would still be good and viable just because of the summer heat. But in the wintertime, you know, we have actually more time to get to those. And we do spend a fair amount of time, you know, going into the field, looking for those that are reported to us and see if we can obtain them and collect samples for them and get them submitted for testing. But our standard protocol is to respond and try to respond within 24 hours, actually. And get as much information we can and determine if that's something we can respond to in a timely manner and hopefully get some samples from.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that. And then Seth commented as well, kind of back to the cost to the hunters. Earlier, we had, kind of posed the question of how much does it cost a hunter to submit on their own to a lab. Seth kind of asked if you could clarify what the cost to the hunter is if they are submitting samples using check stations.
Yeah, I think Seth commented, I think it's around $75 now at the Nebraska Diagnostic Lab. If they were to
Okay.
submit them on their own,
Yeah,
otherwise, go
if
ahead.
it's being submitted through a check station or at a check station.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's that cost, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but we do have a contract and agreement with the diagnostic center there in Lincoln, that we pay for those particular samples in those surveillance zones. Like anything going forward into this year, into those eastern zones, we'll be collecting those samples and we cover those costs and we report those back to the hunter as positive or negative. If it's positive, we give them a call or a letter indicating that it is a positive. If it's negative, usually the results are posted on our website, for folks to look at that as well. But we do make an extended effort to notify those of a positive. But yes, all those are done through the Nebraska Diagnostic Lab. They're in Lincoln, and we cover those costs and make sure they all get there and so forth during that 9-day firearms season in the surveillance zone.
Yeah, and to that end, so the cost to the hunter, there is no cost to the hunter if they're
That's
submitting
correct.
at the check station.
That's correct. And it still is a voluntary submission. We ask the hunters at the time they're checking their deer in if they're willing to submit it, for testing for CWD. And a lot of them, if it's a nice buck or they want to save the cape for some reason to decline, or may decline for various reasons. But those that are interested, we do cover the cost for those inside that surveillance zone.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Todd. Switching gears a little bit, we had a question come up about, are there lessons to be learned from mad cow disease or I guess I would also add scrapie to that question.
Well, mad cow, yeah, certainly. Fortunately, that didn't impact us over here in the United States. That was more overseas, but that was a huge scare, obviously. And a little bit more about mad cow and scrapies. They are actually variants of the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. They are a variant or a different strain type of this whole complex of diseases. So there are similar diseases related to CWD, and mad cow is one of them. It's just in livestock, it's known as mad cow. In sheep, it's known as scrapies. In humans, it's known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So there are already other forms of this disease in other species. So, but yes, definitely a lot to be learned from those as well. And, scrapies, fortunately has been one of them that's been almost eradicated from my understanding. So there's potentially things we can learn from that for being able to really reduce the impact that has had on domestic sheep anyway too.
Yep.
But still a lot to learn for CWD though too.
Thanks, Todd. Along those lines, another question that came in, are there any indications that CWD could jump to another species? And does the response plan address that?
No, there's no indication that it can jump to any other species. And I think our response plan or management plan, talks about some of that too, that there's no evidence to suggest that it's transmissible to humans and nothing else there to suggest that it's transmissible to other species either. As I mentioned, with the previous questions, there already is variations of this disease in other species. And so that's what it's referred to amongst those species, and not so much CWD transferring on its own accord, I guess, to other species because they've already got that. But it's an obvious concern, you know, can it mutate, or can any of the others mutate, you know, and transfer across species lines? So it's something that, you know, we're keeping an eye on and continue to be engaged with across the nation, you know, and continued research that goes on all across the board, you know, trying to identify any possibilities of that. And so far, there seems to be a pretty good species barrier in terms of that type of transmission from one to another.
Thanks, Todd. Another question came in that, of course, a lot of, as you mentioned earlier, and as you look at the map on the screen, there's a lot of states that have documented CWD. All states are thinking or talking about it. And as you mentioned earlier, each state is responding to CWD differently. And to that end, the comment is, I see you are monitoring the disease. What is the plan to slow the spread? And they note that in Missouri, their CWD response plan is very different. Much of their plan is mandatory, whereas all of the best management practices identified in the Nebraska, the draft CWD management plan here in Nebraska are voluntary. Checks are, you know, getting your deer checked, deer or elk checked is voluntary. And they note that Missouri has not had rapid expansion and they harvest over 300,000 deer annually. So just kind of to revisit that. So what is the plan to slow the spread? And what are kind of some of the, kind of reiterate just kind of some of the key approaches that the Nebraska plan kind of takes in that regard?
Okay, well, as mentioned, you know, our approach is still focused on more of the surveillance too, and we do provide those recommendations for individuals or agencies, you know, if they do want to try some of them to reduce that spread of that disease. Yes, Missouri, states like Missouri too, they have made some requirements in terms of checking in deer in specific zones or specific areas, you know, like maybe for the first couple days of the season too, they have a mandatory requirement for CWD testing, but a lot of them still remain voluntary too. But, you know, our focus, like I said, has been, you know, continue with that surveillance, continue the monitoring, and adjust as new technology becomes available. And so I don't know that we can say that we've seen a significant difference, you know, from some of those states in terms of slowing the spread of it or not. You know, that some might indicate that there has been some success, others maybe that have implemented more restrictions, maybe not so much. So, but we continue to work with those folks and continue to work on the research to try to see if there's better means or new technology that becomes available to help us reduce the spread or slow the spread. But right now, we're still focused on the surveillance and trying to see what that spread rate is and the rate of increase, and hopefully some new things will come along or new developments that will you know, maybe give us some indication to go another direction and so forth. But right now, you know, we're still pretty confident in our surveillance methodology and confident in what's going on with the research across the country, and so but we're staying engaged, and I guess that's a big part of it too, and see where all this disease goes.
Thanks, Todd. Another question came in that is looking for recommendations, certainly regarding consumption, but I think by the question also for field dressing. So, for example, they mentioned that early on, when CWD was detected in the, say, early 2000s, some of the early recommendations for field dressing were to not cut through the spinal cord, not cut into the brain, you know, those kind of things. Are those recommendations still relevant, and are there any additional ones you might want to mention?
Yeah, those recommendations are still relevant. You know, it's thought that the transmission occurs, you know, through bodily fluids from deer to deer. So anything around those fluids or the brain where there's, you know, where this disease may exist, you know, certainly want to add more caution to your handling, but obviously to wear PPE. That's one of our number one recommendations, you know, personal protective equipment, you know, latex gloves, a mask, you know, equivalent to an N95 mask. You know, just wear some of that, and you know, take those preventative measures. I think can go a long way in your comfort levels. You know, when handling these deer carcasses.
Thanks, Todd. I believe we've made our way through all of the questions that have been entered into the chat. It's little after 8:15, 8:18 here in Central Time. Are there any additional questions for for Todd and the group here tonight?
I saw one, Kent. I don't know if I touched on that. The one question was asked if how is South Dakota doing with
Oh, yep,
CWD? Yeah,
yep,
too. But
thanks.
yeah, Dave Michaels, I see answered that one. I know him. But okay, so hey, Dave. Um, anyway, but yeah, South Dakota, you know, their management plan probably is similar to ours. You know, they also take a bit of a different approach to it and probably less regimented in terms of their response to CWD too. But they collect samples differently than we do. They don't have mandatory check stations too, so they look at drop points or sending samples in, different things like that as well. But you know, they're probably have some similarities to us in many regards too. But yeah, their response has probably been similar to, at least in less regimented, you know, like ours.
Thanks, Todd.
Mhm.
And then another question just came in that, you know, certainly we all have our individual perceptions of what risk is, whether we are walking across the street, driving a car with a speed limit, or, you know, eating a potentially CWD positive deer. Can you kind of just speak to some of the, you know, when talking with other disease experts across the country about the potential risks of a human consuming CWD positive venison, is there what do people typically consider in that risk evaluation?
Well, I think maybe the easy answer is probably you could follow the Center of Disease Control's recommendations. The CDC recommends to not eat a CWD positive deer. So, but it ultimately comes down to a personal choice. As you saw on the survey results too, there's people that still are, you know, that aren't as concerned about it. And so it will continue to probably go on that way too. But if you want to follow the guidelines from the CDC, you know, if you get a positive deer, you know, their recommendation is to not consume it.
Yeah. Thanks, Todd. And also got a question that is probably we didn't really touch on this early in the presentation. What are the symptoms of disease visually from looking at a deer that's still alive?
Okay, yeah. Well, with CWD, you know, like I mentioned earlier, you guys might have mentioned too, um, you know, it takes a long time to really become symptomatic, you know, up to a year and a half, maybe longer. So a deer can actually test positive for it, that it actually looks quite healthy. And we see that a lot in, you know, some of the check stations, you know, when they come through. But when they do become symptomatic, yeah, some of those pictures, I maybe illustrated it a little better. I mean, they can become very thin, very skinny, showing the bones. Yeah, some pictures like that. And they'll get to the point where they're actually pretty much incoherent, and delirious, head drooping, head down, and or they may just be laying down and not be able to get up. And you can get in close proximity to them. They lose their fear of humans. So things like that are the typical signs, you know, of CWD. But One of the telltale ones definitely is when they get to that extreme point of you know, the ribs showing and those bones showing. You know, that's a pretty good indication that it could have. It may not be CWD, it could be other things, but that is one of the strong symptoms, at least with CWD.
All right. And then our final question, if a deer is sampled at a check station, what is the turnaround time to get back, if a deer is sampled at a check station, what is the turnaround time to get the results back to the hunter?
It typically, running them through the Nebraska Diagnostic Lab too, it takes about 3 to 6 weeks. And again, it depends on the volume of deer samples that we run through in that short amount of time. But roughly, you know, that's the kind of time frame you're looking at. So at the earliest, probably 3 weeks, you know, but it could be out to 5 or maybe 6.
All right. Well, Todd, you had a marathon session tonight, and again, appreciate everyone's patience as we work through a couple technical difficulties this evening, but certainly appreciate your time, your attendance, your concern about the resource. We know everybody here is concerned about deer and elk populations in Nebraska and beyond, and certainly chronic wasting disease is a part of the discussion when we're talking about those deer and elk populations. So again, appreciate your time this evening and look forward to hearing any comments you have. Again, whether or not you submitted a question here, we are recording the questions listed tonight, but you are also welcome to provide comments at the link that was also provided. And if you go to outdoornebraska.gov/CWD, you can find a link there with a comment portion of the website where you can submit a question or comment regarding the CWD management plan as well there. And again, we'll be discussing this with the commissioners out at Fort Robinson at the August 16th commission meeting. And hopefully we'll have a new plan for us to be working under. So thanks again, everyone, for your time, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Kent. Thank everyone.
Todd and Kent, can you stay on, please?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
You want to keep recording? It's still recording, or?